Trump's facing the kind of meltdown nobody thought was possible. A judge just froze his assets nationwide, and the fallout is moving faster than anyone expected. Buildings, accounts, properties, all on the edge of total collapse. 30 bonding companies walked out. Not one trusted him. And now New York is lining up the legal machinery to seize everything if this appeal fails. This isn't rumor. This isn't theory. This is the mechanism of power closing in real time. Trump's empire, piece by piece, could fall. And the moment the ruling drops, the truth hits like an explosion. Stay here. It gets darker.
This decision is lawless. It's destructive. It's dangerous. It's cruel. It's illegal and it's unconstitutional. Donald Trump has done a lot of bad things in the last week, but nothing's worse than this.
I think the uncertainty, the chaos that has happened since last evening when we heard about this has caused a lot of grave concern on the part of older adults who rely on Meals on Wheels as a lifeline.
Chaos and confusion unleashed. Earlier this week, the White House Budget Office ordering a pause on federal aid. The move could have potentially impacted trillions of dollars in government spending, including for some public programs that affect millions of Americans. Now, part of that plan temporarily blocked by a federal judge, but not before sparking intense backlash by Democrats. Despite the short-lived confusion over the order, Republicans supported the move.
I think it's appropriate to take a look at it and make sure there isn't some nefarious actions.
We think that some of the areas that could be restricted, if they are items that the executive branch has the authority to issue or to look at.
He's not halting, he's reviewing it, and in a certain amount of time he's going to release it again. That's what.
You know something is shifting in American politics when the most powerful thing standing between Donald Trump and total impunity isn't Congress or his own party or cable news, but judges, court records, and hard numbers on a balance sheet. We're not just talking about a bad headline or a bad poll. We're talking about the possibility that a former president's assets, his bank accounts, his signature buildings could be frozen, carved up, and sold because courts found he lied about who he is and what he's worth. That's not a side story. That cuts right into the heart of how he built power and what accountability looks like in a democracy. Let's walk through what actually happened here. Because buried under all the noise and memes is a simple, brutal sequence of events. A New York judge looked at years of Trump's financial statements, not campaign speeches, not rally posts, actual documents, numbers Trump's team sent to banks, insurers, and regulators. The judge compared those numbers to reality and concluded Trump had been dramatically inflating the value of his assets. This wasn't a slap on the wrist situation. The court said plainly, this was fraud, and the consequence was a massive judgment, around $454 million in disgorgement and interest. That's nearly $500 million. For once, when Trump bragged about big numbers, the numbers were big, but not in the way he wanted. This wasn't an award, it was a bill.
A lot of them live paycheck to paycheck, paycheck by paycheck. So when we're talking about all of a sudden Head Start being frozen and Head Start facilities not able to access the portal yesterday, we're suddenly Medicaid frozen. You know, Medicaid is what pays for the majority of people who have an elderly parent or grandparent in nursing home. So those are just two of the many, many examples where government funding interacts with the normal daily lives of many of my constituents. So I heard outrage yesterday. And by the way, so did the Trump administration, because by late yesterday, they were backtracking on a number of things they had said just the night before.
And now a federal judge has paused this program, at least until Monday. And I'm wondering if in those intervening days, if you think that...
Now in our system, if you lose a case like that and you want to appeal, there's a process. You don't just shout witch hunt and leave. You need an appeal bond. Think of the bond as the court's way of saying, fine, you want to fight this? You can. But if you lose, the money to pay the judgment has to be there. It's a guarantee for the people who won the case. Here's where the curtain really got pulled back on the Trump myth. His legal team went out to the market, to about 30 different bonding companies, and said, back us for the full $454 million. These are companies that exist to do exactly this: evaluate risk, issue bonds, collect fees. This is their business model. And one after another, they looked at Donald Trump, his assets, his prospects on appeal, and said, no. Not one of them would take the risk of backing him at that amount. That's extraordinary. These aren't political pundits. They're professional risk calculators. When that many independent firms all decide, separately, we don't trust this guy to make us whole if he loses, that's a kind of verdict all by itself. It's the financial world saying, your numbers don't convince us. Your reputation doesn't reassure us. You are too big a gamble. Trump's own lawyers admitted this in court filings. They told the court that getting a full bond for the entire judgment was practically impossible, that they would need collateral worth roughly $1 billion, that the usual avenues simply weren't working. Think about that. This is a man who has spent decades branding himself as the ultimate deal maker, the billionaire's billionaire, the master of leverage. But when he needed the market to vouch for him at scale, it wouldn't. So the case landed back at the feet of the appeals court, and now the judges had a problem. The law expects some form of security for a judgment like this, but the defendant is saying, I can't get it in the usual way. Do they let the judgment sit with no protection for the state? Do they treat Trump like any other debtor and allow immediate enforcement? Or do they find some hybrid solution that keeps the appeal alive but doesn't let him walk away? They did what courts often do in tense situations. They compromised. They reduced the bond requirement to $175 million, less than half of the original judgment, but still a huge amount of money. That move didn't erase the fraud finding. It didn't say, never mind. It simply said, we'll accept the smaller bond so the appeal can go forward, but this case is still deadly serious. Trump scrambled, moved money around, tapped whoever he needed to tap, and managed to post that reduced bond. For the moment, that meant no sheriff showing up to lock doors at Trump properties, no state marshals auctioning off office towers, no bank accounts formally frozen under judgment liens. But this is where his supporters deliberately confuse people. A temporary bond isn't a clean victory, it's a timeout. While all that was playing out, something else important happened at the appellate level. A higher court reviewed Engoron's decision and the punishment. It ultimately upheld the core, the fraud findings. The appeals court said, in essence, yes, Trump did this. Yes, the conduct was wrong. It did, however, reduce the monetary penalty, saying the original amount was too extreme under constitutional limits against excessive fines. So the final price tag shifted, the exact number changed, but the crucial foundation stayed. A court of appeal agreed that Trump had engaged in fraudulent practices. In plain language, the system didn't excuse him. It adjusted the punishment. It didn't wipe the slate clean. He wasn't vindicated. He was marked. Now let's talk about what happens when someone with a judgment like that simply doesn't or can't pay, because this is where the phrase freezing assets becomes very real. There's a whole toolbox the law gives to people trying to collect on a judgment. Judgment liens, garnishment of income, seizure of bank accounts, forced sales of property. None of these tools are designed specifically for Donald Trump. They're built for everyone. If you or I lost a big civil case and refused to pay, the creditor could ask a court to record a lien against our house, attach our wages, or empty certain accounts. Being rich or famous doesn't magically remove those options. A judgment lien is basically a legal claim attached to a property. It says before this asset can be freely sold or refinanced, the judgment has to be dealt with. Once that lien is recorded in the public records, it sticks to the property. Any buyer, any bank, any title company sees it. It's like painting a giant red flag on the deed. You can't just shuffle the building around on paper and pretend the debt doesn't exist. Then there's garnishment. If you have a judgment against you, a creditor can ask a court to order your employer or your bank to send part of your income or your account balances straight to them. It's a way of turning your own financial flow into a pipeline to the person you owe. For someone like Trump, whose financial life is heavily tied to real estate and complex entities. The details are more complicated, but the basic idea holds. The court can reach into the streams of money and divert them. And if those measures aren't enough, the creditor can push for forced sales. That's the nuclear option. The state can ask a court to authorize the seizure and auction of specific properties until the judgment is paid. You don't get to set the timeline. You don't get to pick the buyers. You don't get to wait for the perfect market. The property goes to the highest bidder. The proceeds go toward the debt. And if the sale doesn't cover the whole amount, you still owe the rest. That's the sequence Trump was staring at in New York. Letitia James didn't speak in vague generalities. She talked specifically about properties like 40 Wall Street. She made it clear, if he didn't satisfy the judgment, those assets were on the table. For someone who built his image around shiny towers with his name on them, the idea that one of those towers could be legally taken and sold off to pay for fraud is devastating, not just financially, but symbolically. There's another layer here that doesn't get enough attention. When a judgment lien is recorded against a property, that doesn't just threaten some future sale. It immediately changes how the owner can use that property. Try getting a new loan backed by a building that's carrying a massive fraud-based judgment lien. Good luck. Many lenders simply won't touch it. Others will demand brutally high terms. That means less cash flow, less flexibility, less leverage. Trump's whole business persona is built on leverage, borrowing against properties, flipping deals, constantly moving and refinancing assets. Judgment liens are like ice in the engine. They freeze that motion. Even before a single property gets seized, the mere existence of those liens can paralyze the business model he's relied on for decades. Now, put all of this in a broader political context. This is the same person who, in office, treated public money with the same "I'll do what I want" attitude he applied to his private finances. When his administration ordered sweeping pauses or freezes on federal aid, including programs that touched Medicaid, Head Start, Meals on Wheels, and other lifelines for older adults and low-income families, a different set of judges stepped in. You had federal courts issuing injunctions blocking those freezes, saying, you can't just yank funding that Congress authorized and people depend on, not without a lawful process. That was another form of asset freeze, but this time, the asset being protected was public funding meant for ordinary Americans, and the person being restrained was the president himself. So you start to see a pattern. Whether it's his personal real estate empire or the federal government's budget, Trump approaches money like it's a personal weapon. For his own businesses, he inflates asset values to look richer and more creditworthy than he is. In office, he tries to pull funds away from programs and communities he doesn't care about, to make political points or reward allies. In both cases, the breaks come from the same place: courts, judges saying no. That's not how this works. The rules apply to you too. That's the through line here. This isn't just about one case in Manhattan or one program in Washington. It's about whether the rule of law still has the backbone to restrain someone who's willing to burn through norms for personal gain. And there's something else we should say out loud. This kind of accountability is slow and unsatisfying. It doesn't look like a Hollywood moment. It looks like years of filings, hearings, appeals, and technical arguments over things like bond amounts and lien procedures. People tune out because it's not flashy, but buried in those boring-sounding processes is real power. When a court says fraud, that matters. When a judge forces a former president to scramble to raise a 9-figure bond, that matters. When an appeals court upholds the core finding that he lied and abused the system, that matters. When bonding companies line up and refuse to trust him with their money, that matters. All of those steps are small, cumulative defeats for the idea that wealth and office let you float above consequences. For democracy, the stakes are even bigger. A system that won't enforce basic financial honesty against a former president won't enforce basic democratic norms either. It's all connected. If you can walk into banks and regulators with fake numbers and glide by, why wouldn't you also try to strong-arm election officials, pressure judges, or weaponize federal agencies? Once someone gets used to the feeling that rules don't apply to them, they carry that into every arena they touch. That's why this case isn't just about Trump's net worth. It's about whether the guardrails we always talk about, independent courts, professional regulators, evidence-based decisions, actually function under stress. So far in this story, they have. Imperfectly, slowly, but they have. That should matter to anyone who cares about the country outlasting any one politician. It's also a warning, because if a future Congress, a future president, or a future Supreme Court weakens these tools, makes it harder to prosecute fraud, harder to enforce judgments, easier to politicize funding, then the next person who tries this will have a smoother ride. The message from this whole saga should be that lying about your assets has consequences. Abusing the public purse has consequences. Trying to live outside the law has consequences. If instead the message becomes, this was too harsh, too messy, too uncomfortable, let's make sure no one important goes through this again, then we're teaching the exact opposite lesson, that power means never having to pay your bills. So here's where we are. Donald Trump has faced a civil fraud judgment in New York. Courts have affirmed that he lied about his finances. The original penalty was scaled back but not erased. The bond drama exposed his vulnerability in the financial markets, and every step of this process has underscored the same basic truth. He's not above the law. He can delay, he can spin, he can rally, but he cannot unsign those orders, unwrite those financial statements, or undo the findings that came after. For all the drama, that's the simplest and most important part of the story. A democracy survives not because powerful people always behave themselves, but because the system is willing, eventually, to call them out and make it hurt when they don't. In Trump's case, that hurt is no longer theoretical. It's written into judgments, bonds, and liens. It's etched into appellate decisions that say, yes, this was fraud. And if there's any hope in this mess, it's this. The same machinery that can freeze his assets, block his aid freezes, and strip away his financial illusions is still available for the next would-be strongman. As long as that remains true, as long as courts keep choosing evidence over intimidation, there is something in this country that money and bluster still can't buy.